slides. Some of you were here last year when we talked about this, and some were not, so just to bring you up to speed. This is our initiative, it's tied to, and if we go on to that committee. So there's our committee. I want to point out Ray Darby, who joined the committee. He came into the Pioneers, it's one of the things he was interested in. This guy, not only did he help with the editing of oral histories, he actually transcribed several. He bought some doodad that he could stop the tape, and so he's really performed, and he did that on Sweeney's, which, as you can tell, he had a lot to say. Go ahead for another one. Next slide. Our clicker's not working here. So just to remind some of you, and some of you who were not here, last year when we were looking at this, we were saying, what are the issues we need to address? And a little further history of the history, 2002, 2004, this project was started. Money was raised, a lot of energy from some pioneers, some staff from JAUSA involved, and then over the next decade or so, that activity really slowed down. There's very, very little resource put into it. Archivist was hired, but so part-time, that as good as they were, they couldn't get a lot done. So that's what took us to this, is who should own the process, how will it be captured, will JA maintain the museum? It's been a big concern of that, and what's the role for pioneers? So that's what we were talking about a year ago. And a year ago, this was the current reality. The materials in the archives in Indianapolis went up to about 2,000. So if a researcher went to the archives then, even today, you could assume that JA hadn't done diddly squat since 2000. The data just wasn't there. There was a lot of material in a warehouse in Colorado Springs, boxes and boxes and boxes, and also a lot of objects there. And 45 oral histories had been taken, but none were completed. None were in a way that we could get to them. So go ahead. So here's a picture of the warehouse in Colorado Springs, and the goal was to get that to there. So the archives in Indianapolis are not really a lot to look at. They're just very well documented, cataloged, in acid-free boxes, climate controlled. Documents are going to last for a long time there. They're not sexy to go to though. Okay? And this was our work plan. Empty the warehouse, propose a solution for the documentation of artifacts. And by that I mean things, not documents, but stuff. And complete the oral history and communicate to JA areas. That's what we were about. So we go forward. So a status on a few of those activities. Last year, in July 2017, there's where we were in terms of transcriptions. We have these tapes. The last archivist hired by JAUSA had transcribed 14 of them. It's a little laborious project. Now we have 28 completed. We spent some time testing a few transcription services, identified one that I've been using in Indianapolis. They tend to be people like court reporters, and they have their own businesses in transcription. And I think they're doing a pretty good job. Frankly, we tried some that when they came back, they were barely English. They were so poorly done, it was just clear that they didn't ever read them after they did them. So that took a bit of time to get there. The editing phase, 9 have been edited. And the editing phase is that some of us who are familiar with JA need to take those transcripts and you catch the jargon, you catch things that a transcriber might hear but not know what NAJAC was, and in some cases add some parentheses so that, assume that somebody's reading this who doesn't know anything about JA, because researchers do use the archives. So doing that, and then just editing enough that the sentences are clear, but that we do not lose the voice of the person that was interviewed. So we're not trying to make these ready for publication, just trying to make it so you can follow the story, but that the distinctive personality of whoever you were interviewing comes through. And then releases. The original plan, when people went out to do the interviews, was that they would get a release from the person that they were interviewing at the time, that they were okay that that be used throughout. And I think that part was not probably as well communicated as could have been to the interviewers, because we had very few. And even the ones that we had last year, they're someplace at JAUSA, I don't have them, but then, so we've reached out to some folks that are still living, and we'll be reaching out to heirs to get these releases. Because there's a limitation of how accessible they can be through the archives if we do not have those releases. So that's a dilemma. And then the status of getting stuff out, 2000, up to year 2000, the 2 years ago, some of us went over to the archives because they told us they had duplicates. We threw away probably 60 boxes of materials that were duplicates. Great. And there's an expense to storing those duplicates. And so how does that happen? Well, it may have been more, actually. There were boxes and boxes of kits of duplicates. The archivist wants one, which, they'll know where they are and they can find them. So how does that happen? It happens because boxes just get shipped. People don't look in the boxes. My best story of that is I found in one file 30 copies of Dave Luce's resume. and really, they only needed one. No, they probably didn't even need one, but they certainly didn't need 30. So we did do a cleanup on that and get rid of that things. And then there were photos and media that had been sent previously, but none of it scanned. We were fortunate that the archivist that we work with she really likes us. And she called and said, there's a group in Bloomington that has a grant to do this, to do scanning and stuff of media. And so if we can get your JA stuff down there, we can get it done free. So what's available now through them have been done for that grant. Okay, let's go forward. So as Marty mentioned, we had the meetings with JA. I think, as he said, we got some clarity about their owning it. I think that you may have picked up, I was happy that Ed was in that meeting, because I think Ed began to see that there's a connection between the history and our branding and our story about JA. How does an organization last 100 years? Really built to last. And it's that history of innovation. So I think that he's beginning to see that there's a resource for him to use in advertising and in brand management. This second bullet I thought was amazing, but the archivists from IUPUI, our senior archivist there and PhD, went to Colorado Springs and spent a week in that mess that I just showed you in the warehouse. We're not getting anything done. No documents were being moved. So IUPUI paid her expenses, and JAUSA agreed to pay, they paid her salary. JAUSA paid the hotel and travel expenses. And so she was pretty much just heads down in that warehouse the whole time she was there. Now, she's a professional. She could not determine in every case if it was something that they didn't already have, but she had a pretty good list with her of what they had. So when she left, and they're sitting on a pallet now in the warehouse, about 100 cubic feet of materials that are ready to be sent to Indianapolis. And then it takes a good deal of time for them to go through all of that with every single document. So it'll take them maybe 18 to 24 months to do it. When that's completed, there'll still be some gaps, but we'll have things there, resources up to 2016. So that's good for keeping our history. It's also good for the context of keeping the museum up to date and the museum continue, because it's like the stacks of a library, or an art museum has what they're exhibiting, and then they have warehouses full of art, and they choose what art to bring forward to tell the story that they want to tell right now. And the resources for telling that story were limited. So that's where we are there. All right. There are still gaps. And I get this information from the archivist, from meeting with her when she came back. So there are a lot of gaps from board minutes and things like that. But she did have some conversation with folks in Colorado Springs about how do we get that? How do we get those board minutes sent over? How do we get them done electronically? As you heard with the education folks, lots of things are being done, even in the programming area, electronically. So we need some good methodology, and they certainly have the resources to receive it, to get those things that are now going to be presented electronically into the archives. And of course, a lot of how we do business anymore is electronically. I think one of the dilemmas in the future will be the context, capturing context, because it tends to be, we used to write white papers, and pass them around. Now we have emails of how things are developed. So there is going to be a bit of a dilemma in understanding that. The photos, as I mentioned, that they had before were scanned, and I have a time sent out to folks, I think the link where you can go and actually look at some of the old photos that are there. And those are on that link and to be reviewed. In the 100 cubic foot stuff that Angela identified to take back, there are photos and electronic media, film, and things like that. Those are not going to get scanned right away. So part of what decisions they were making when she was there was her saying, look, this stuff is not going to be processed in time for your centennial. And so she didn't take things in conversation with JAUSA that they might want to use, they might want to have access to in the next year for the centennial, because Ed's been doing some scanning there of things that he wants to use. So I think there's a cooperation going. We would say there's been no updates in many years. I mentioned my observations about how our heroes, their pictures are there, but not why they are our heroes. So there are opportunities there. Ed in his presentation mentioned how that update could happen to be more consistent with the branding strategy and with their 3 points that they're looking for. The 100%, 100 years, 100% ready. Well, the museum has that opportunity to tell the story of the innovation and the consistent innovation that JA has had over the last 100 years, which is why it's still vibrant today. But right now, in my opinion, those connections to the artifacts in the museum don't make those connections. They don't tell that story in the way that they could by connecting those things. And they made a commitment to update the museum. They put some money in the budget. We've agreed to match it. And so that's really a good thing. And then we have an MOU that is just aimed at the museum and the archives. So you have to have your you have to have the resources to keep the museum up, and we wanted that to be a longer lasting thing. So going forward, continue to work on the oral histories, recruit more editors. That's the constraint right now. And I sort of dropped the ball this year on getting out and being, trying to get more editors. But that's the big constraint. People who will say, I want to spend a few hours doing these edits and sending them back in. The releases is another constraint. We'll continue to work with IUPUI and sort of liaise between those two groups to get things to happen, like the archives going to Colorado Springs if we need to do that again. And then collaborate with JAUSA. So I think that's the last slide I have. Here are the dilemmas that I see over the last few years. One is that dilemma on the oral histories. Not enough editors and people who are willing to do that. And I hope some of you might be encouraged if I get around to sending out the list. I promise I would. You might want to do one. You might want to do one, although everybody in this group's engaged, to say, oh, that was one of my mentors. I'd like to edit fill in the blanks interview. So that's a constraint and a dilemma that we need to work on. Another is that this is not a priority for JAUSA. And that shouldn't surprise us. Look at all they're doing. And these folks are mighty busy. And so to have a priority of somebody to complete getting stuff out of the warehouse is one thing. We've made a big move there, but there's still more to do. But the other dilemma is some sort of disciplined process going forward so that you don't get to that picture that I showed you in the warehouse. That's what we would have called in the utility industry deferred maintenance. And the whole thing about the materials is it's a maintenance. And if they could get a process going, and I'm not at liberty to tell them how to do this, but it seems to me that that this could be part of their records retention policy. Every organization's got a records retention policy, the things you have to keep for this many years, this many years, this many years. And so that would be my great hope, is that somebody might be able to do that, and that they could put somebody in charge of doing it. Doesn't need to be a senior vice president. But I think one of the things that we'll want to pay attention to is that we don't slip back and start building another 20-year backlog, because people just don't have time to pay attention to it. It's more expensive in the long run to wait, to not take care of it, then it's just more expensive to go through it to do. Opportunities. I think there are opportunities to tie what JA is doing in their future to the history in the museum. I think that could be a very compelling story. A dilemma for JAUSA is that they don't train like we used to. When I worked at headquarters, we had a group of campers coming in about every other week. Almost every new employee came to Colorado Springs for their training.